There's something haunting and beautiful to me about abandoned places. Empty churches, the ruins of collapsed cathedrals, and in what remains of Edith Finch, an old abandoned family home. Places that tell stories. You can see the imprints of the past people have left behind, consciously and unconsciously, that tell us what this place meant to them, the secrets they kept, even why they abandoned it. If you go now to the town of Pripyat, you won't find anyone living there. You'll find 15 primary schools with rooms like these, strewn with pages of textbooks with nobody to read them. There was a theatre, an amusement park, 15 kindergartens, and just as many factories as there were secondary schools. You'll find towering apartment blocks, a pattern stacked high over and over. They weren't rich in Pripyat. They were workers. You'll find marks on the walls to record how tall their children were, unwashed dishes that they were too tired to clean, lines of shoes that visitors took off when they entered the house. Move just 20 kilometers down the road and you'll find the village of Zalicia, where there are balls and dolls that children used to play with outside. People lived here, normal lives like you and me. They didn't have the same amenities as we do, but they had the same hopes. The same love for their families and their homes even. You can see it ingrained into the village. But you won't find anyone living there.
Внимание, внимание! Уважаемые товарищи! Городской совет народных депутатов сообщает, что в связи с аварией на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции в городе Припяти складывается неблагоприятная радиационная обстановка.
In 1986, at 1:23 in the morning, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded and began pumping lethal radiation into the air.
It's now clear that the Soviet Union has suffered one of the worst disasters in the history of nuclear power.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden.
As the cloud of radiation grows, so too does anxiety throughout Europe.
It took Communist Party officials 36 hours to order the evacuation, and another 6 to actually start getting people out. The thousands of people that lived in Pripyat and Zalicia were told to only take their documents and some food. No time to pack up the rest of your life, just go. Not even the landscape, the trees and animals could escape that suddenness, that unearthly eruption. The whole place now is covered in the red forest, named for how the radiation killed the trees for miles around the power plant, leaving them with a signature red hue. I mean, there's really not a more perfect metaphor, is there, for these kinds of places that can't help but soak up the past in a way we can see, in a way we can feel, even today. In what remains of Edith Finch, the house is uncomfortably saturated with the past. Every inch of its walls are covered with photos of people and memories. When you walk up the stairs, you'll see this broken part of the balustrade overlooking the first floor. Looking at it, you know someone fell there some time before, and you're left wondering how. An accident, maybe, a fight, perhaps they were pushed. But the past has left this scar on the house that tells a story of its own. Maybe you never get the full story, but you get the questions and fragments of the answers. Before you ever reach the house in the first place, you find these old faded papers about a missing boy, Milton. Dozens of them just scattered to the wind. And then you find his letterbox, and it's empty. Everyone gave up looking after a while. The rooms of your dead relatives, who all met their own grisly ends, have been sealed up with these great metal bars, the edges glued down so that not even the air can escape. But there are peepholes too, so you can look into the past as it was, frozen in time almost. Like the red forest of Chernobyl, the walls might as well have been dyed red with Finch blood for all they've suffered. And yet as you walk through this house, without ever meeting a single one of them. You look around and you start to understand this family, that they're weighed down by the baggage of their past, and in time, it broke the family apart. Unable to stay, unable to move on. Edith Finch is one of a small genre of games that is sometimes unkindly called walking simulators. And yes, there is a lot of walking involved a lot of the time, but these games really capture that feeling of wonder and intimacy that I get from these places. Oftentimes, the setup for these stories is that you arrive in an abandoned place and have to find out why it is the way it is. What happened? Who were these people? And in their absence, it asks you to do that by relating to your environment around you. In Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, you arrive in a small English countryside village after, well, everybody's just upped and vanished and you have no idea why, it's there in the title. In Gone Home, you expect to return home to a loving family, only to find it completely abandoned. In Tacoma, you're investigating a seemingly abandoned spaceship in hopes of uncovering the truth about what happened here. Ray Bradbury's short story, There Will Come Soft Rain, speaks to the powerful stories that abandoned places can tell.
The entire west face of the house was black, save for 5 places. Here, the silhouette in paint of a man mowing the lawn. Here, as in a photograph, a woman bent to pick flowers. Still further over, their images burned on wood in one titanic instant, a small boy, hands flung into the air. Higher up, the image of a thrown ball, and opposite him a girl, hands raised to catch a ball which never came down. The 5 spots of paint, the man, the woman, the children, the ball, remained. The rest was a thin charcoal layer.
You can just feel the absolute emptiness of this house. A nuclear blast has destroyed the city, its people, and the house is the only thing left to tell their story. And I think part of the reason that these stories capture that feeling for me so well is that they understand how powerful experiencing these places alone can be. Just wandering in solitude without a tourist guide or a school class or a carefully planned guided path. It becomes purely your experience, nobody else's. Something that's rarer than you might think for a lot of people. I know it is for me. And it's not just in the sense that these games are nearly always single player. It's rare to see other people in these games at all. If you do, then they're still and unmoving, not truly alive like you are. Or in Tacoma, they're just projections of the past that aren't aware of your existence. They're inhuman. Because these places are profoundly intimate. You're looking into the nooks and crannies of other people's lives without them even knowing. It's just you and the walls or the town or the ruins. In these games, not only is there nobody to stop you from sneaking into rooms that were locked away, climbing over fences that say do not enter, but you're encouraged to read poems scrawled on the walls of closets in people's rooms, to read journals hidden under the floorboards. Where before these places were divided up by people, hidden like people guard their secrets and their private lives, they're all just open to you now, almost vulnerable. It's like the space can open up to you without other people getting in the way, that you can experience these imprints of the past honestly. The closest thing to describe it is that you're being let in on this precious secret that almost nobody else gets to see. But the weird thing is, humans have always believed in the personally transformative power of connecting with a physical space, especially empty and abandoned places. Our old myths are full of sacred sites that had power long before we ever found them, that violating them would end in death and destruction, but also that just being around them, meditating alone with them, just listening to them, can be genuinely enlightening. In Norse mythology, Odin didn't become wise by talking with Mimir, the wisest of the Aesir, but by drinking from his well, communing with a physical place that transformed him into the Allfather. When the Buddha attained enlightenment, he did so under the gaze of the Mahabodhi tree, that it supports the weight of enlightenment and connects you to the stars and rest of the world, fostering your growth. Anthropologist Keith Busso discusses the power of places in Indigenous stories in his book Wisdom Sits in Spaces.
Places possess a marked capacity for triggering acts of self-reflection, inspiring thoughts about who one presently is, or memories of who one used to be, or musings on who one might become. The experience of sensing places, then, is both thoroughly reciprocal and incorrigibly dynamic. When places are actively sensed, the physical landscape becomes wedded to the landscape of the mind, to the roving imagination.
When Basso describes these places as reciprocal, it's easy to understand why. In Odin's story, the space doesn't just transform him by giving him understanding and knowledge, but it takes his eye from him. That we leave part of ourselves in our environments as much as we take these places with us, that we incorporate them into our sense of self. Changing as a person is just as much about cutting parts of ourselves away as it is finding new ones. After all, we can see what the people of Pripyat left behind of themselves there. We can see what the Finch family left behind of themselves in their house. But this reciprocal power isn't restricted to the natural world. We've come to believe this about man-made places too. Temples and holy sites, even haunted houses, are all places where communing with a physical space can reveal the truth about ourselves or the world or the past. But for me, abandoned places do the same. They force me to think about who these people were, and from that, who the hell am I, and from that, what are we leaving behind? I've read a lot of books over the last year, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. It stayed with me this whole time, always in the back of my mind, just ticking away, and I think I might finally know why. It's a story about this profound connection with an abandoned space, being transformed by it, being colonized by it.
I understood why no one lived in Area X now, that it was pristine because of that reason, but I kept unremembering it. We did not know what had happened here, what was still happening. With nothing left to anchor me, I needed to be here.
The main character constantly reflects on this abandoned place around her, and those reflections cause her to understand herself differently, to deconstruct what it means to be herself. The story repeatedly refers back to this pool she had when she was younger that she loved to watch, that had been left so long it had been transformed into a little world of algae and fish and creatures all of its own. She thinks about how all of that life is interconnected, that the lines between life blurred, and that it only became possible because humans abandoned the pool. And the same had happened to Area X. After all, when humans inhabit places, we do our best to keep strict lines between dichotomies, the natural and unnatural, the inside and outside, the living and dead. And yet now, even the line between herself and the world around her begins to blur. And Annihilation understood that experiencing these places is most profound when you do it alone. Even though there are other characters around her in Annihilation, we never learn any of their names. They are the biologist, the surveyor, the anthropologist, and the psychologist. Much like the statues of the people that we meet in What Remains of Edith Finch, these are impersonal, dehumanized. We rarely get to know anything about the other characters because this isn't a story about characters relating to each other, but how one character relates to the world around her, how it transforms her.
The beauty of it cannot be understood either, and when you see beauty in desolation, it changes something inside you. Desolation tries to colonize you.
When I'm alone, I find it so much easier to take in the world around me, to let those lines blur and let it affect me, to be colonized by the things it wants me to feel and understand. Abandoned places are also often spaces of desolation. Chernobyl's nuclear breakdown, Pompeii's volcanic demise, the village of Yalton's sudden disappearance. It's mesmerizing to see humanity's greatest efforts to bend the world to our will just be done away with. Nuclear power plants, whole cities, spaceships in the sky, give it 50 years and the world forgets us all. There's a poem by Sarah Teasdale called There Will Come Soft Rains, and yes, it has the same title for a reason, that I think is really worth reading here.
There will come soft rains, and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pools singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white, Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire. And not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly. And spring herself, when she woke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone.
Just like said in Annihilation, that desolation colonizes. It makes you feel small because give it 50 years and Spring herself will scarcely know we were ever there. The desolation is a reminder of our own impermanence, and that just as we abandon these places, they too will abandon us without a second thought. Now, not all of the games in this genre I've been talking about feature this kind of natural disaster, forcing us to abandon this place. But there is always the desolation. Just of a different kind. In What Remains of Edith Finch and Gone Home, it's the desolation left behind by a fractured family. Boxes packed, but never taken. Dishes used, but never washed. Windows dropped, glasses smashed. All because they couldn't get away from the place quick enough. And you feel that, the weight of it, the baggage, the pain when you walk through these places just the same as you do in Chernobyl. And given how drawn we are to places that tell stories, it's no surprise that we return to ones of desolation over and over again. You can see the imprints of the past in the world around you no matter where you go. But abandoned places of desolation tell dramatic stories about heroes and disaster and death and pain. We make TV shows about it. Places like this have such intense experiential dimensions. Immersing yourself in them is deeply moving. Desolation has a sense of permanence to it too. A state of complete emptiness or destruction. It's irreversible, it's undeniable, it's unforgettable. Even if we tried to pave over what happened at Chernobyl, the radiation is still in the water, it's still in the trees, it's still in the earth. Its most irradiated areas will remain that way for 20,000 years. The land itself will never forget. It will always tell that story. It feels like when humanity is long gone, whatever comes next won't find our triumphs or glories. All anyone will be able to find of us will be the desolation we left behind. Because it lasts. House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski is one of the most intoxicating books I've ever read. That's really the only word I have for it in all of its connotations. In it, the Neverton family moves into the house on Ash Tree Lane in hopes of starting anew, only to find that the house itself shifts and changes around them. A closet appears, then the house is somehow just a quarter of an inch bigger on the inside. Then they find the hallway. Sometimes it's miles long, and the staircase that descends into the deep nowhere.
When revisiting places we once frequented as children, it is not unusual to observe how much smaller everything seems. Knowledge is hot water on wool. It shrinks space and time. Is it possible to think of that place as unshaped by human perceptions?
And I mean, it's true, isn't it? There's always the physical space, its dimensions and exact measurements in centimeters and inches, and then there's our experience of it, which might be similar, but it's always just a little off, a little different. In House of Leaves, Neverton becomes obsessed with navigating the hallway and stairs. He wants to understand them, to know them, to map them out in this strange attempt to control the house, to control the world around him. Fears of the unknown literally deepen the hallways, they lengthen the stairs, making the physical and experiential space one and the same. The book itself even mimics our understanding of the space in its typography, how it lays out its words. But this division between the physical and experiential space is something that we find in the real world too. Take a place that you know well and cover it in darkness. It becomes a foreign country, its shadows hide the unknown. Places have always been warped by our perception of them, but also by the stories we see in them. This happens everywhere we go, but I found it becomes even more intense in these abandoned places that have such visceral stories to tell. Both Edith Finch and Gone Home involve returning to an abandoned family home. But Edith Finch's house becomes more and more claustrophobic the more you learn about the tragedies this family has faced. The walls laden with memory begin to press in on you in ways that they didn't before, almost like it's shrinking around you, especially as you need to squeeze through smaller and smaller gaps to move around the house. It's no wonder that Edith tells you how she experienced the place right at the start. I was afraid of the house. It looks relatively normal, even homely to us at the beginning, and this feeling only creeps in as we hear the stories the place holds. The stories change the space for us. In contrast, the long hallways of Gone Home become more isolating the more you learn about how your younger sister came out but wasn't supported by her family, that this new place was unwelcoming to her. The walls don't press in on you like they do in the Finch house, but feel empty and isolating, almost like it's got a population in the negative, almost like they get bigger as the sense of alienation grows. Her hideout in the roof reminds us of all the things we hid from our parents. It's a refuge. Annihilation deals with this experiential space too. The characters begin arguing about whether a structure in this abandoned landscape is a tower or a tunnel, fighting for their perception to define the space.
Something about the idea of a tower that headed straight down played with a twinned sensation of vertigo and fascination with structure. I could not tell which part I craved and which I feared.
Where Chernobyl's empty apartment towers become these dark, tragic places of human failure that make us feel small, the same apartment towers in the ruins of Near Automata almost fill us with nostalgia for a time we never knew. Over and over, the stories they tell will change a space. You've probably heard of liminal spaces before, strange places that make you feel uncomfortable just by looking at them, and it's often because they're largely abandoned. Well, a lot of these places are the same. The very space is changed by our perception. If you're American, people have probably asked you, where were you when 9/11 happened? In my town, we ask you, where were you when the earthquake happened? The earthquake, as if it were the only one. I was at school. It was 2011, and I was here. The lunch bell had just rung, and I was underneath this concrete balcony. I was next to a brick wall with a glass staircase leading up to the school library. That was when I felt the world creaking. We'd actually already had another big earthquake just a few months before then, so, we were used to them, even big ones. So we gathered on the field and we talked. It was just another day in Christchurch, wasn't it? Until word started spreading that buildings had collapsed in the city centre, that people were dead. We didn't know how many at the time, but the numbers started climbing. 10, 50, 100. Of course, when we look back at the desolation now, all these years later, we know how bad it truly was. We have the full picture. But it's hard to grasp the sheer horror of what it's like not knowing how bad it truly is in the moment. That what has already happened, and what will happen cannot be stopped. For all we knew, it could have been thousands dead. New Zealand is a small place. Everyone knew someone who lost someone. The earthquake changed the city as much as it changed the people in it. And almost symbolically, like in a real-world disaster movie where the Statue of Liberty is toppled to represent the fall of the United States, the earthquake destroyed the steeple of the Christchurch Cathedral that had always been the city's icon. It's lying behind me now, still in ruins, still not fixed, all these years later, because money problems and who should pay for it and how it should be fixed. But to me, it feels like the city is refusing to let go, that it can't let go, that the past is permanently a part of this place, and you can feel it. So it lies there, wounded, telling a story about what we lost. When you're here alone, when I'm here alone, you can hear that story. It affects you. You can't stop it affecting you, sticking with you, seeing the gaps that haven't been filled. You can see where people prayed and gathered. You can see the pieces of the rubble of lives that still haven't been picked up. Phrases like kia kaha written on walls that mean stay strong. that speak to that unique sense of community we really had that only comes out of tragedy. Where Chernobyl makes me feel horror, Christchurch makes me feel loss. I'm left asking, when all you are crumbles away, how are you meant to rebuild yourself, your home, your sense of control? What are you meant to leave behind, and what are you meant to move on to? That's what this place wants me to feel. There is a hole in the middle of my city, both literally and figuratively. And you can come here, you can see it, you can feel it. You can go to the dead center of one of the biggest cities in New Zealand and it will just be quiet, filled with imprints the past has left on this place. I can only say you should do it alone. Places of desolation always call into question everything we assume, everything we take for granted. Civilization feels like it's going to last forever, but here it is, wiped away in an instant. And because of that, desolation has a way of reminding us what truly matters. What you have, what you should cling to, what you should leave behind. Kia kaha, Christchurch, stay strong. Or in the wake of the 2019 Christchurch mosque shooting where 51 people were gunned down, we said, they are us. You can still see the memories of it. And always when you're alone, because then that's all there is. Like Chernobyl and the Finch House and the village of Yalton and Area X, this place doesn't forget. And when you come here, it infects you with that story of melancholy and hope. I suppose the desolation has colonized me, and I'm better for it. Maybe it'll colonize you too.
do